Hey, welcome to Lab, the podcast. Grateful to share some time with my friend Barrett Swartz. He's the VP of Relationship Management at NCF, and it is Christmas time. So it's like my favorite time of the year.
Yeah.
So we do not have a Christmas decoration on this table, which I will fix. But Barrett, good to have you. I'm going to introduce Barrett formally, and I got to read this because you got a great bio. And as I was reading, there were some things I didn't know. So Barrett was born in Greenville, South Carolina, moved to Tampa Bay when he was just 3 years old. Attended UF and earned a bachelor's degree in finance. While he was at UF, actively involved in RUF and the Warrington College of Business. Currently a member of Trinity Presbyterian in Lakeland, Florida. After graduating, started a career in wealth management right here in Tampa before going to New York City and serving some time up there in the construction and real estate industry, and then came back here to take this role as VP at the National Christian Foundation, where you serve faithfully for the last 4 years, passionate about people. Barrett, and I can attest to this, finds joy in meeting and serving others in a meaningful way, particularly in the message of generosity, which is what brings us here today. So helping youth, mentoring people, hanging out in the sports world, you're just an all-around good guy. And so thanks for sharing some time. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me. Happy
Yeah.
to be here.
Yeah. We have so much stuff to talk about, but that theme of generosity, I think it was a year ago, maybe just over a year ago, we were with Brian Sanders, who also is with NCF, having a similar conversation about generosity. And it's one of those parts of expressing the life and beauty of the gospel that I think is fundamental, and we'll get into that. But you embody it. You're just a generous, big-hearted person, and I've been privileged to know that about you and see that. And when we started this podcast, the whole idea was to cultivate the life and beauty of the gospel in the world. That's why V3 exists, to express the life and beauty of the gospel. And we've been saying it more, like letting out the secret, but the whole secret of the impact of V3 is really the people who participate in our ministry. We embody the life and beauty of the gospel. We make it visible. It's not just an idea, but it's an embodied reality. And so time like this helps us to have conversations where we can look at different aspects of the life and beauty of the gospel. And I think generosity is at the center of that. So we'll get into that. We'll talk Brno. You went over and traveled the world with us a little bit, but I want to start with UF and your journey to UF. Why did you choose UF? Was it finance that brought you to UF, or was that just because you were in Florida and you make some people mad if you say too much about that? But why UF?
Oh, well, the truth behind going to UF was I was in my junior year and my mom was like, you need to start applying for colleges. And then she gave me a list of colleges I need to apply to. And I got into Florida and it was the best school I got into. So that's where I ended up going. I didn't really have a huge plan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually started out in engineering.
Okay.
And quickly learned that I was not made for engineering and switched to finance.
Was finance anywhere on the horizon early on in your imagination, or did you have like a particular aim toward engineering and then radically shifted?
Finance definitely was in there early on. I was pretty entrepreneurial as a young kid, and that actually kind of plays into my story of where I am now. And my mom gave me some money to invest with in high school, and so that was kind of sparked. So it was an easy switch from engineering to finance once I realized engineering was not for me. I didn't know if I was going to be able to use my people skills in engineering. I'm sure there's some ways people can do it, but that wasn't me.
So mom gets you in crypto, and then after crypto kind of blows up, you go into finance.
I wish.
Yeah.
She's all about Bitcoin now.
There you go. Everybody is. It's like this, right? That can be our insider trading conversation. But you study finance. Did you, going into UF, already have a pretty well-formed Christian imagination? Was your faith well-formed? And then that naturally kind of merged together with your imagination about finance? Or was all of that being shaped at the same time?
I'd say I was pretty informed going into school, but my dad's a pastor, so I kind of grew up hearing a lot about generosity and the message of generosity and giving money away. And I got to see it firsthand with my parents. And I'm super thankful for that. My father was incredibly generous whenever somebody was in need. I got to see that firsthand. But like everybody else, your story's got to become your own. So I got to UF and thought I was a little hotshot, and the faith, it was there. I was going to church, but it definitely took a seat on the back burner. And then as life crisis has evolved and things happened, it was my junior and senior year of school where God really started shaping my faith and kind of bringing me back to Him and all the truth I had learned from childhood and growing up in the church. There was a great need for it, and
Yeah.
so I finally started seeing my need for a Savior, my need for help, and that was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. Getting in just a hard time in college and starting some good counseling and learning about my story and who I am and what God's going to use me to do in the world.
Yeah. Was it, a lot of people I think have a similar, at some point in the life, whether it's childhood or early adult or later in life, there seems to be a point when you kind of come to the end of yourself, and it may not be like theological investigation or some grand search for God, but you literally come to the end of yourself and it starts that search. When you were confronted with that kind of crux moment your junior, senior year, had you been wrestling, when you look back on your story, is there evidence like, hey, God was working and stirring and kind of actively pursuing you for a while, and finally you kind of soft-hearted enough to turn and respond? Or was it like a more dramatic, punctuated junior year, something happened to catalyze that turn?
A little bit of both. And one of my favorite books of all time, Narnia book, the
Mm.
third one, The Horse and His Boy, at the end when Shasta encounters Aslan, and spoiler alert, if no one's read it yet, you definitely should read it. But when Shasta encounters Aslan and he's like, I must be the most unfortunate boy that ever lived.
Mm.
And Aslan's like, I don't call you unfortunate. He's like, well, don't you think it's unfortunate to encounter so many lions on your journey? Attacked my friend, scared me in the graveyard, chased me down on the horse. And Aslan's like, I was the lion.
Mm.
There was only one lion in the graveyard. There was only one lion chasing you.
Mm.
And I love stories and beautiful stories like that to look back at my story. And all of these little key figures and points and messages that God had been dropping through my journey ultimately ended up at that really big point where I came to the end of myself. I kind of realized that I didn't like being me.
Mm.
I didn't like me at all. And having someone on the other end of me to see that and hear me say that out loud and have their heart break for me, be like, Barrett, I don't think that way about you. But more importantly, the God of the universe doesn't look that way about you. That was a pretty pivotal moment. That's where it kind of clicked for me that no matter how big of a sinner I am and how much I've messed up, that the God of the universe has his eyes on me and he's crazy about me.
Mm.
And from then on out, still ton of struggles, still mess up, but that was when I really started trusting that he was for me.
Yeah. It's so one of the things I've loved about getting to know you is you do love stories, and you've got a good imagination for stories and for beauty, and you have a really bold faith. And I always love that. Like, we get to be around so many incredible people, artists, thinkers, young people who are really, they embody their faith in radical ways. But we were introduced through Ed Savitz, a friend of ours, and a member of our team, and he introduced us over lunch, and he kept saying, you got to meet this Barrett guy, you got to meet this Barrett guy. And so finally we had lunch, and I think the idea was around a conversation around generosity in your work with NCF. And I think we connected more over Francis Schaeffer and books and things like that. And I just
Yeah.
saw a boldness in your faith combined with this whimsical love of stories. Who in your story contributed most to those two unique things, right? The boldness side, maybe your dad contributing, your mom contributing, but where did the story side of that get nurtured in your story?
Yeah, I'm definitely a closet nerd. I think people are pretty shocked to find out how much I love fantasy and stories like that. But being the youngest of four kids, I think that played a huge part into it.
Mm.
My brothers loved reading. They read all the time. They loved Lord of the Rings. They loved Narnia. And it really came from my parents. Every single road trip we were on, there was audiobooks going.
Yeah.
The Narnia full cast audiobook, which is amazing. They have different voices for every character. And there was just something beautiful about that. And really it ultimately stems from my dad explaining every good story has some notes of the gospel to it. You can't get away from it. There's a playbook, and it's a limited playbook that we have because we're not God. And so ultimately every good story is going to be tapping in to the truth and the beauty of the gospel.
Yeah.
And so hearing that from my dad, now whenever I see a movie or see something that strikes me, my first thought is how is this intertwined to the gospel?
Yeah. It's a great lens. Like you think about the four great conflicts in literature: man versus God, man versus himself, man versus nature, man versus others. Like all those great struggles in literature and film and art, at the end of the day, it's all asking the question about shalom. Like, how
Yeah.
will there ever be peace in those areas? And there's one where God has made peace with man. And I love Francis Schaeffer on this. He says it's one of those is solved not by man but by God. You know, man versus God is a conflict that's brought to peace through God and his work on the cross. That's the peace that brings that conflict to an end. The other three, he says something interesting. He says there can be substantial healing in those other areas where we see disparity, where we see conflict. And again, I think generosity is a part of that,
Mm.
right? Like the gospel not being an idea, but transforming your life. And I want to ask you about an early childhood story. You don't have to tell the whole story, but you had a early childhood moment with money that you remember. And you shared this story with me, and it was impactful that you realized that there was a way that you were relating to money that maybe you didn't realize it till later on. You look back on it and you go, wow, I always had a gifting maybe or an entrepreneurial thing, but it wasn't aligned rightly. You know, my loves weren't ordered. So maybe go back to that. Is that the earliest moment that you can remember where you really noticed that there was kind of this, not only a gifting and an imagination for finance, but also a competing love around money?
I forgot you knew that one.
Not to out you on this. So you don't have to share the story if
No,
you
it's a
don't want
great
to, but
story. It probably is the earliest, most refined one that I've spent time pondering. But a good friend of mine named Timmy, it was really his idea growing up. Timmy Horst, who lived on a golf course, and he had this amazing idea. Why don't we go find golf balls in the woods and start selling them to golfers? And we did. We would go find them in the woods. I mean, it was swampy. There were snakes and everything. And we'd find thousands of golf balls. And we even had a whole sheet lined out of how much we were going to charge for each one specifically. And so I'd set up this little stand in my parents' basically backyard selling golf balls to golfers. And some Saturdays we would leave there with like $300-400 each. 12 years old, 10 to 12, somewhere in there. And that's
real money.
insignificant.
Yeah, that's real money.
Yeah. And I just remember distinctly, gosh, it must have been the winter of 2007, maybe a little bit earlier. My parents got us these electronic safes, my four siblings and I. And you had a little code that you could tap in to get into it, and you keep your money and stuff in there. And I remember figuring out that if you took the batteries out from the bottom and unscrewed it with a screwdriver, you could reset the password to 0000. And I'll never forget.
Genius. Yeah.
Sorry, Will.
Yes.
Going into his safe and taking out a crisp $20 bill, going to my wad of cash in my closet. It was probably like $500 or $600 as a 10-year-old, and adding the $20 bill to that big stack of money. And looking back, it's like, oh, enough was never going to be enough.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to have God use my story to have a little greedy kid like that and somehow get him to start spreading the message of generosity and giving.
That crazy. I think even enough not being enough is part of that was, as I thought about having this year-end conversation, thinking about generosity, the life and beauty of the gospel expressed through generosity. I came back to that story and I was like, man, so many of us, me included, have that early childhood, like how much is enough? And as soon as you get to what you thought was enough, it's not enough. And then there's more. I mean, it just seems to be like that. You went to UF, made the pivot from engineering to finance, came into wealth management. And so you're around wealth that maybe was probably maybe beyond the scope of what you had been accustomed to as a kid, growing up as a pastor's kid. And then you go to New York. How did your time in New York shape you? And what did you experience around finance and just that is enough going to be enough? How did New York play into that part of your story?
That's a great question. I was a genius, and I picked the perfect time to move to Manhattan. It was December of 2019.
Yes. Get ready. Yeah.
3 months before COVID. But I did learn a lot about myself in that 3 months and afterwards. But as you get to New York and you realize the hustle and bustle is a real thing. There's a buzz. There is a grind. People want to make money. and they'll do it at any expense. And I was basically working on like an open floor with people who very, very sales oriented, and it was kill or be killed. So I learned a ton about myself and a ton about greed. And I'm really glad in retrospect that God sent COVID to get me out of there.
Yeah.
But it was a ton of fun, and I really enjoyed my time there.
Yeah. It's crazy that we all think like there's finance areas coming from Oregon, uh, rural area outside of Portland, right? And it was farms and communities and small towns, and that's where we grew up. And I grew up with incredible privilege, but working class, middle class family, and so just not shaped around that kind of drive for resource and
Mm.
for money. And Tampa, very different from the communities we grew up in. And then you go to New York or you go to LA where there's that energy where it's just like we are going to spend our lives, right? We're going to use the time to try to get wealth in order to get to a point where we can use that wealth to enjoy lives. But I think Frederick Buechner uses this very turn. He said, like, so many of us use our entire life pursuing wealth in order to use it later in life, but we find out later that we've used up the life that we hoped we could enjoy that wealth with, something like that. You got out early before that grind, God kind of plucked you out of
Yeah.
that and radically put you in a different position. So talk a little bit about your role at NCF. And it's using your gift, your training experience, that entrepreneurial thing, your finance degree. It kind of all of that was prepared in advance for your role at NCF, but it's different. It's thinking differently about finance. How are you looking at your role? Like, what is your role at NCF and how is it different from the floor in New York?
Well, it's significantly different. And God was incredible to me in the fact that the first lady I worked for at a college in wealth management was on the board of NCF. And so she was the one who planted the seed very early on. And when COVID happened, she reached out to me and said, "Hey, there's a role available. I know you want to stay in New York, but it's back here in Tampa. I think you should just apply." And so I did. I wasn't sure if I wanted to work for ministry. I didn't really know what NCF was. And then after my first interview, I was like, oh, this is God opening up his hand and saying, "Barrett, this is you.
Mm.
You're basically going to be doing your favorite things. You're going to be dealing with people, dealing with their finances. You're going to learn a lot about generosity. And that is you. You're all three of those things." So he opened that door for me to come back home. And now my job is basically coming alongside people, figuring out with them where they are in their generosity journey with their giving, whether we need to do that through tax planning around giving or just thinking about their general story and their faith related to it. And basically almost being like a generosity counselor and walking through life with them.
Mm.
And everyone's got a unique part of their story that they're at. But how do we think about that end goal of where they want to get to, what their legacy is going to be on this side of heaven? And how do we think through that in a smart way? So it's the best job in the world. I got to pinch myself every morning.
Yeah.
I love telling people how much I love it.
An amazing job. I love the idea of kind of guide on the side in the finance space that, yeah, all the training and experience, the knowledge about the strategy and tactics in finance, all important, but really the heart of generosity and the desire to come
Yeah.
alongside people and say, like, what's your dream? Like, what's God calling you to, and catalyze that? I've watched you do that. And your passion is really just people and like, what is God doing in the life of a person?
Mm.
And I think that's when I think about the life of and beauty of the gospel and generous giving, a generous heart, I don't know if there's a more like one-to-one expression of the life and beauty of the gospel than generosity, right? Because you think about God's love and like he loved us to the end. He
Yeah.
who didn't withhold his own son, right? Like giving. God so loved the world that he gave, right? Like it's laced within the DNA of
Yeah.
who God is. So that's my view. But you're a finance guy. You went to UF. I did not. Is that like, do you see it as that essential to the expression of the life and beauty of the gospel, that a generous life
Yeah.
is a part of the life of Christ maturing and bearing fruit in and through us? Is it that like one-to-one essential in your mind?
Absolutely. We we serve a God, we worship a God who never calls us to do anything that he hasn't already done himself. And he doesn't call us to be generous because it's going to make life better for us. He calls us to be generous because that's who he is. And if our highest calling is to love him and become like him, what is he like? He's the most generous person ever.
Mm.
You know, Jesus literally had all the riches and wealth, if this is all true, in eternity, and stepped down from heaven and put on a skin suit. The creator of the universe decided to go sit in a womb for 9 months. How generous is that? When he could be doing whatever he wants in heaven with all the resources of all time for the sake of others to lift them up. How can I not in turn want to mirror that and become generous like him? Because once you tap into his generosity and you've received it, all you want to do is be a conduit for that generosity.
Yeah.
And he's coming at us with an ocean of generosity. The fact that we're alive and breathing, the people in our lives, the richness and the beauty of exploring the world and the art he has for us. An ocean of that. How can we not try to put a little bit of that water into a squirt gun, and use that on the rest of the world?
Yeah. When you describe that, like, I love, for V3, we see the vision is Jesus. Look to him, look like him, look with him. And when I think about that, look like him, and you just think about the stories in the gospel of Jesus. And I love The Chosen, I think, has done a great job portraying him in a very beautiful and human way, right? Like that God became man. I mean, this is Christmas, like the incarnation. We get to look and go, what does the love of God look like in the flesh? Well, you've seen it. You've seen it in Christ, who gave in so many extraordinary ways, right? And I mean, right now, everybody's probably thinking of a story, but when you think about the generosity of God expressed in Christ, other than the cross, obviously the highest expression of that. What story flies to your mind? Like when you think of the generosity of God in Christ, what story pops to your imagination?
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is, what other holiday does everybody give gifts on?
Mm.
There's no other one. And it's very theologically accurate because Christmas is about giving.
Yep.
That's why we give gifts, because God gave his only son. Do you mean a specific like biblical story that comes to mind about generosity?
Yeah, if there's just one where you think about like Jesus if you could have been there on the ground to watch him
I
and be
think,
like,
and it's not a lot of what I think people overlook this passage a lot. Maybe they think about it, but it just clicked for me in the past few years. And it's the story of the rich young ruler. And Jesus says, if you want eternal life, give up everything and come follow me. And we don't know what he does. Hopefully he did. I don't think there's anyone in the entire Gospels in human form that Jesus could relate to more than that guy. Because who is the original rich young ruler? He's looking in a mirror and he's saying, you should do this, my guy, because I've done it and it's been rewarding, and I'm on a mission and I'm going to go complete this mission and die and be resurrected in 3 days. And it all comes from me giving everything up. I had to leave it behind.
Yeah. I love that. And that little turn, I think that is an incredibly wonderful way to look at that story, and probably one that a lot of people have not thought about. Like he's literally saying, that is me, right? Right.
Yeah.
Oh, so good. So good.
We have a God who never calls us to do something he hasn't already done himself. And that one is just staring us in the face. And I feel like I overlooked it for so long.
Yeah. It's so crazy too, because we hear Jesus make this invitation, and the idea that he came that we might have life and have it to the full, like this incredibly abundant life. And then he meets us and he's like, so here's how you get it. Come give everything away. Right. And you're like, what? I didn't see it like that. And yet you describe it like there is something about living in this way that is who you were made to be. And as you follow in that way, you will experience more than adding one more 20 to that wad of cash that you already had. That is not as full as it is to pour that last 20 out. And you'll experience something different here than you did here. In your work with people, what do you think is the barrier that is like the crux of the thing that rich young ruler probably felt within him? That's like, oh, is it trust? Is it fear? What is that thing that kind of keeps us from just going like, yes, I'm in?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think Keller basically says the opposite of love. A lot of people would say it's apathy or indifference, but he makes the point that the opposite of love is really fear.
Mm.
Perfect love casts out not apathy or indifference, it casts out fear. Fear moves away and love moves towards. And my natural inclination for pretty much everything in my life, especially in a lot of relationships, is fear.
Yeah.
Really scared of being hurt or hurting, which creates that lack of trust. And I think that's ultimately where it stems from. Am I going to be enough if I actually give this next dollar away? Can I take this leap of faith?
Mm.
But thankfully, like I've mentioned before, we worship a God who never calls us to do anything he hasn't already done himself.
Yeah.
So the more you look at Jesus and understand the life and the work of who he did, the more you're going to become like him.
Mm.
And so the more I look at him, the more I can push Barrett to the side and become like Jesus. It gets a little bit easier to give that extra dollar away. It gets a little bit easier to have that really tough conversation that you don't want to have.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I love about generosity. And the same thing with prayer, because like if you categorize your life into a bunch of different sections, like your finances, your fitness, your family, you have all these different sections. Prayer and generosity, while there is the gift of giving, prayer and generosity, I don't know if you necessarily need a quadrant for them, because both of them should permeate every area of your life.
Mm.
Generosity isn't just with wealth. Generosity is with your time, your family, your talents, your treasures. A generous person is going to just ooze generosity in every area of their lives.
Mm.
And that all comes from becoming more like him.
Mm. So crazy that you bring that up. We just on the Wayfair podcast had a conversation about fear, and we were looking at the reality that so many Christian thinkers have landed there and said, really, it's fear is this reality of the potential for loss or diminishment. That's really what's happening in fear, is that I'm scared that I'm going to lose something or be diminished in some way, and so I become afraid. And Jesus, talking to this rich young ruler, is trying to say what, the father of the prodigal son and his brother said, like, everything I have is yours.
Mm.
Like, the reality of our relationship in Christ is, and this is what's so stunning about the gospel, like, we literally are children of God, like adopted into a family where God, who is God, the source and center of everything, says, like the father of the prodigal son story, like, everything I have is yours.
Mm.
I think the journey to get there, to try to wrap
Yeah.
our mind around that,
Yeah.
that's hard, right? Like, people talk about a poverty mindset. Certainly I have that, like,
Yeah.
that it's not enough because I can't imagine a source of love and abundance that is mine. Like, we haven't experienced that. And to be adopted into a family, like, think if Jeff Bezos adopted you and just was like, hey, everything I have is yours.
Yeah.
Full stop. You have access to the boat,
Yeah.
to the house. I just saw a house he bought in like Washington, D.C. And bought it like on a block. And I thought, I can't even imagine how much that would cost in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Everything I have is yours.
Yeah.
As you see people start to catch up to that reality, right? We hear like generosity will change your life, and you do these journey of generosity stories. What have you seen? Is it joy that you see? If you could say one thing increases in the life of people who really do just start to full on live in this posture of generosity that believes that everything I have is yours and you can live without fear like that, what would you say is the marker that you see consistent in the lives of people who are radically generous?
That's also a great question. I think joy would be the ultimate into that, but there's a lot of steps along the way that help you get there. And like you said, trust is the big one. And I think it's Brendan Manning, but maybe he's quoting someone else. He says, so big is like the deal where we actually really fully start to trust our Abba, our Father. It could be called the second conversion.
Hmm.
And that leap of trust that I'm accepted and loved as I am and not as I think I should be, because I'm never going to be as I should be.
Mm.
That is that leap of trust.
Mm.
And it's very, very intrinsically tied to what you have.
Mm.
That includes your finances and your home. And generosity, a lot of times in people's lives, it takes a pretty big blow up to encounter Christ, and or at least just see their need for a savior. I think generosity is very interesting because it can be like, it's not artificial, but it can create that crisis without actually having to go through a lot of pain and suffering with other people.
Mm.
Because if you look in the mirror and realize all of us at our core are not generous and we're not giving, generosity itself can be the very tool to create that crisis, to realize like, oh, I don't think I'm gonna have enough. I don't think God is enough. And it kind of creates that space to fall more in love with him. And the outflow of that trust, of really believing that you have a heavenly Father who's crazy about you, he's delighting over you, he's singing over you, and everything he has is yours.
Mm.
It makes it a lot easier to give it away.
Mm.
And the outflow and the ultimate end of that is just joy. And that joy really stems from knowing your Father's delighting over you and the fact that you're becoming like him.
Mm. I love just the idea that you can't think your way into a new way of being, right? People have said that so many times in so many ways. Like we have to act our way into. It's one thing to have a presupposition or an idea and be like, okay, right? God is generous. To look like God is to live a generous life. It's a fundamental expression of the life and beauty of the gospel. All great, but there's something about participating, embodying that is where the joy is found, right? Just knowing it, right? I said this when I was writing, like, I get it, but I don't have it, right? Yes, this is the truth of the gospel, but I'm not experiencing that in my life. And somebody could come along and say, well, start giving it away, right? Like if you have 2 coats, give one away.
Yeah.
And in that moment, you'll experience the reality of the gospel, the joy that comes. And I think what you've seen, you shared some stories and gave me a glimpse into some stories where I just go, man, what a joy to live like that. Like to give yourself permission to live like that. It's incredible. This is why I think you do have the coolest job on the planet, because these are sometimes we're so scared to have money conversations or to think about wealth or think about things. But the reality is it's like the most fun way to transform, participate, experience joy is really pretty cool. Now, we connected also because you're stewarding a group of young generosity, right? Or young people thinking about generosity, which I think is really cool. And in fact, you were a huge catalyst to the Zinzug Symphony being recorded, right? And God stitched our stories together with Barrett in an extraordinary way through Ed, through Jared Thomas, who's on our team, through some mutual friends, Karen Juan Osario Kennedy. And that all of these little threads brought us to this moment where you introduced us to a group, the Ambassadors Club, and gave us an opportunity to just share what God is doing through beauty and allow people to open up and participate. If not for that, I don't think the door would have opened, right, to go see what God did in Brno. Before we get into that, talk about Ambassadors Club, because Brian and I were talking about the generational change. There is a huge shift taking place right now. Like there's a transfer of wealth from the boomer generation, kind of skipping X, but going down below. There's a big transfer of wealth, and millennials are thinking differently about generosity. What are you seeing from that younger generation? And what's God doing with generosity, and how is that connected to the Ambassadors Club?
Yeah. The wealth transfer from boomers to millennials, I think there's a bunch of different estimates, but $80 trillion is very feasible. By far the largest wealth transfer that's going to happen in like a 5 to 10 year window ever.
It's crazy.
And I think one of the unfortunate problems that came out of the boomer generation, you were always kind of, in general, taught to be pretty hush-hush about your finances. Obviously, some people weren't. But what's interesting about this next generation is my generation wants collaboration. They want to do stuff together. They want to create together. And you see that Brian always talks about it. Like you go into a Best Buy is not a Best Buy. It's a bazaar. It's got like 8 little mini shops inside of it. You got the Apple store, the T-Mobile store, the electronics store. It's a bunch of different little shops inside of it. And as we think about generosity and giving, how do we come together as one and unify and think about that question of generosity? And how do we tap into that $80 trillion that's coming and use that for generosity to change the hearts of the people that are giving and change the hearts of the people that they're giving to? And so I've been tasked with that role at NCF. I'm super thankful they've given me that job. And it's been a pretty messy way of getting there, but by God's grace, we actually tomorrow is our last day for giving into this quarter. We're actually going to build a few churches in Colombia. But I think after we send that grant out in the past year, it's been 1 year, we'll have sent out $180,000, a bunch of 20 and 30-year-old kids.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
In one city. That's
One
just
city,
in
just in
just
Tampa.
in Tampa.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. For me, when I hear that, and I was in the room and I got to see the faces of people, so I was encouraged. Generally, would you say, as you start to have generosity conversations in that millennial population and below, are you hopeful? There's a desire to be transparent, collaborative, all these things. Like the younger generations have some acumen and intelligences are really cool. Are you hopeful in this space of generosity, or do you feel like there's a lot of ground to be broken and ground to be taken back? Because I think David Brooks said, I wrote it, I tried to write it down. I won't get the statistics right. In 2000, so year 2000, basically two-thirds gave to charity, right? Two-thirds of people gave to charity in some way. In 2021, less than half of people did.
Wow.
So, like, David Brooks is a columnist, well-respected guy, and he said he was just tracking this and saying there's something in the heart of us that has needed to be addressed. And people have said, like, charity's a gift to the heart, not the hands, right? It's a heart thing. But are you hopeful in this younger generation that there is already a groundswell that says,
Yeah.
we want to steward this wealth, not just for ourselves?
I'm incredibly hopeful, and seeing it firsthand. What would it look like if every city around the country had one of these groups? What's the momentum with that? And there's been a few people where they came, and there was a social aspect of it, but now they've came every single time we've had it. Come every time we single had it. And one of them just wrote the most insane check I've ever seen for a guy in his 20s. And his heart is really changing towards generosity and buying in and believing like, oh, this is the way.
Mm.
And that's what's really interesting about it is you think about a 20-year-old and he's going to be super successful. He was on the path to have a big mansion, have a big family. He'll still have a family. He's married. But that little course correction of thinking about generosity, it's going to completely change the outcome of his life. He's going to live in a much greater dependence on the Lord versus moving towards that cultural push towards independence.
Mm.
And that's why it's so key to capture those 20 and 30-year-olds because, like you said, those people who chase after the money, they wake up when they're 70 years old and they missed the whole thing called life.
Yeah.
And generosity is a way to just tap into the heart of who God is and live life to the fullest.
Mm.
You've never met an unhappy, generous person. You've also never met somebody who becomes generous that really wants to backtrack from where they've gotten in their generosity. Mm. There's always kind of this push to be more and more generous as you go along. I think it's pretty rare for people to have a flip switch where they're generous and then go back to being not generous. So there's a ton of hope, and I've gotten to see it firsthand, and I'm so thankful for my role to hopefully spread that, and I'm very thankful because it continually drips on me, the idea of generosity, because I'm still not very good at it. It's going to be a lifelong thing. I just hope by the time I'm 80, I'm a little bit better.
Yeah. It's so cool to see. And I love that you're hopeful. I think that I'm hopeful as well. I mean, one of the things I love about V3 and our team is it's so young. Like there's so many young people. And as I learn from them, I'm just like, I'm amazed at you and our team. And I just go, man, like there's way more ahead than behind, right? So you're gonna make me cry, Barrett. Here, I got to read this. This is the Buechner quote that I was trying to find. There are people who I love this. There are people who use up their entire lives making money so they can enjoy the lives they have entirely used up. Oh, right? Love Frederick Buechner. But there are people who use up their entire lives making money so they can enjoy the lives they have entirely used up. I think the older we get, I love that you're talking about this change happening in the 20s because I'm not an elderly person, but I'm 47. And when I got hit with the aneurysm news this summer, I got caught off guard thinking like, oh yeah, I don't know how long I'll live, but I easy have 10 years, right? Like I'm healthy, I eat right, don't do the crazy things. So easy have 10 years. And when that news hit, I was like, wow, what if life is shorter? Like, am I really stewarding what God has given me
Mm.
and living in the spaces as generously, as boldly, as courageously as I could be? And
Yeah.
I'm still in that. I'm still wrestling with that. But I'm encouraged by what I see in the
Yeah.
young side. I was also encouraged by your particular understanding of beauty and your immersion in Tolkien and Lewis and stories. I see a little bit more why. But one of the areas where Christians historically have had massive charity and generosity and stewarded wisely was in the area of beauty historically. In the short term, modern era, not so much. That's a space that we've just completely backed away from. And obviously, V3 is called in the Renaissance in that
Hmm.
space, particularly, which is hard fought ground because a lot of people don't see that as
Yeah.
meaningful space like Christianity historically always has. What was it? Why is beauty important to you? When you think about investment and patronage and the investment and stewardship towards beauty, why did that connect with you? I'm curious.
Yeah. Love that question. I think it ultimately stems down to what we said before, or what I said before, and what V3's whole mission is. If the whole purpose of life is to fall in love with our Maker and enjoy what He's given us with Him, and then in turn become like Him, what is Jesus like? And what are Jesus' favorite two ways to communicate in the Gospels? He asks questions and listens,
Yep.
and He tells stories. And what is art? What is beauty? They all tell a story. What is the Bible? It's this incredible love story of God's mission to come get His people.
Yeah.
It's a story.
Yeah.
And what does art do? It tells stories. There's nothing better to captivate the mind of somebody who's antagonistic towards the gospel or antagonistic towards life and other people than a story.
Mm,
And stories just wake you up.
yeah.
And so I was just always drawn to movies and stories and the hope and the longing for more, Sehnsucht,
Yeah.
the desire to go out for more.
Mm.
But I think it all definitely stems down to Jesus was the best storyteller of all time.
Mm. It's so cool to hear you. This is another reason why I'm so encouraged because C.S. Lewis said imagination precedes reason. It doesn't supersede it, but it does precede it. That there's something that a story does that you Emily Dickinson, tell the truth, but tell it slant. There's something in a story. There's something in music or visual art or poetry that opens me up to that truth, right? Beauty to goodness to truth. That way of thinking, you and your generation, I think, just intuitively knows like that's just who we were made to be. And so why not participate in ways that are telling the greatest story of all, right? And so I appreciate that about you. And I know where you got to be careful on time. I want to go two places really quick. One is so out of that desire to help us tell stories and to tell the greatest story for the life and beauty of the gospel to be expressed wondrously, right? To reveal it wondrously, invite people to know God personally. We do it through music. The Symphony Project was massive. It is a 40-minute story that's telling the story of the gospel through music. And I will tell you, it's opened up more conversations already for me to share the gospel because people go, wait, tell me about the symphony. What is that telling?
Yeah.
What's the music about, right? Just opening doors. And it was beautiful. So thank you for helping that project. Just like God was ahead of us and behind us in that project. But you flew yourself over there. You put yourself on a plane to say, I want to come and be a part of it. And that was really meaningful to me as a friend that you would spend and sacrifice your own resource to meet us there and to watch and participate. But we were watching it come together, and there was a moment where you had your hands open, and I don't know if you were praying or listening or what, but we were all in the balcony, and I walked by, and I had to pray and just be like, "Thank you, God, for connecting our stories." But then for showing me something, because I was discouraged that day. I was tired and I'm old, so it was a harder trip for me than probably everybody else. But I was tired, and I walked around the corner, and you were right in the corner, and you were praying, and you just had this countenance about you, and I was like, "Wow, God, thank you that I got to see that." And what was happening in the room as you heard that piece of music in that moment? I don't know if you remember that moment, but I don't know what was going on, but your countenance was just lit up. And I was like,
Yeah.
God, what are you doing?
Yeah. Man, I remember that moment. It's forever etched in my brain. I took a picture. all of this work leading up to the symphony being produced from Ambassadors Club. I don't think I'd slept in 40 hours. The election was the day before, so it was just crazy. We had a big NCF event, and just getting there, and the music, not me being like, oh, I need to like focus this or whatever. The music arrested me.
Mm.
There was finally just this stillness, and the chaos of the few months leading up to it, and all the travel and everything that had been going on in my life, and the music just arrested me.
Mm.
And I, for that moment, just really believed like, oh, God is amazing, and he's given us really cool things to enjoy.
Mm.
Then you add on top of that all of the different stories of the people who have brought it together, the story of the symphony itself, the story of your life and how you came to Tampa and how we met.
Mm.
And the beauty of the art drew me to ponder that and sit with it. And I couldn't help but just sit there and be so thankful to be there, so grateful to be there.
Mm.
And the fact that God gave 92 people the talent to play these incredible instruments to blow my mind in person for a few hours.
Yeah.
It was incredible.
Yeah. It was, well, thank you for telling me. We hadn't talked about that, but I was just so curious to ask you because you mentioned the 92 musicians who played, the composer, everything that came together. And we're hoping to bring it to Tampa in 2025 to play it live here. The Straz seats 2,600 people. And we just thought, wouldn't it be incredible for the story of the gospel to be told through music in a completely new way, not a new way, but a new way for our moment, an old way and a new moment. But we hope stuff like that happens, but it's not possible, right? Without people being generous and participating, being collaborative, doing it together. As we make the turn towards year end, and we got to be quick on this because I know I got to respect your time, but think about this for the person who's sitting there going, you know what? Yeah, my heart is stirred. And as I look back over the year, God's been so good to us. I want to do something. People say that year-end giving is kind of the moment that so much generosity breaks loose. What are just like two things that you would encourage people as they think about the year end and they think about being generous? What are two really practical things that you would say to everybody listening that wants to express the life and beauty of the gospel through generosity? To just nurture that and to do it wisely, right? Because we're called to be wise and to be prudent. And so how would you nurture that generosity? And then what's a practical thing that you would say, hey, to be wise in your giving, think or participate in this way?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind. One of them is I get to hear all these crazy stories of radical generosity, and it's amazing. And it's so easy to look at that and kind of almost be exhausted or like deterred by it because it's like, I can give my whole business away. Like I can give $1 billion away this year. How can I have an impact like that? So it's just to think about your story, where you are right now in 2024, your generosity story, and how are you going to take a few steps to become more like your creator and become generous? Just a few simple steps. That's the heart behind it is your story. There's a reason you are where you are. There's a reason God has given you what he's given you. How do you try to outgive God a little bit more next year? You're never going to outgive him, but just take a few steps forward. And there's a lot of practical ways to do that. If you don't necessarily know where you want to give, hopefully you want to give some to V3.
Yeah.
The technical side is, it really is the donor advised fund, which NCF got the IRS private letter ruling for in 1982. It's the best giving vehicle that's ever been created. It's the largest giving vehicle in the world. And say what you want about America and all of our issues and problems. Our country, more than anywhere else in the world, because of its Judeo-Christian values, favors the generous more than anywhere else in the world. And December is typically the time people utilize that because that's when you need to get your taxes done. So the donor advised fund, the beauty of it is you don't necessarily have to give to a charity right away. You can park your money in there and get the tax deduction. And then over the next however long you want, you can give that money away. And so it's a very simple but efficient tool. And what's really nice about it for me is you've got your charitable bucket and you know that's your charitable bucket. So you can have some good plans around that and give recurring giving. But then when you encounter somebody or a ministry that needs giving, you've got this charitable bucket in the back of your head and you're committed to giving that money away versus, mixing it up with your savings and your checking and trying to do that. So that definitely comes to mind.
Yeah.
One other thought I keep having in here is like doing the symphony and doing what V3 does. It does go against the grain of what we're taught in America and the West because we are all about efficiency. And one of my favorite things I've learned about the gospel and looking at the person and the work of Jesus is love is not efficient. It is not efficient. If if we didn't know who Jesus was and we saw how he loved people, we'd be upset because it's like, why aren't you reaching more people?
Mm.
Why are you always focusing on the one person you're encountering versus the whole crowd around you? In that regards, just thinking about your story and your generosity, how do I become more like him in my own way? And then as I think about V3 and what V3 is doing is like, the symphony is like this atomic bomb to that idea that love isn't efficient. Because it's like, how is this symphony going to change people's hearts? Well, it's like we're thinking about the long term. We're thinking about these conversations we're going to have with people. And beauty is something that draws you back into the very heart of the gospel.
Mm. That's so
Sorry.
beautiful. No, thank you for saying that. I've thought about that woman who, the perfume jar and the expense of that perfume jar breaking and pouring it all out, like not withholding anything, and the extravagance of that gift, and even people looking at it and just being like, what are you doing? Like, there's more prudent
Yeah.
ways to spend that. And Jesus smiling in that moment and just being like, no, she sees something different, that oil, that fragrance that's going to permeate, and the heart to pour that out.
Mm.
There is a beauty there that we're talking about in 2024, right? That someone would do that. And so I loved that. I saw, I think, the same thing when it's like, it's not efficient, but it's beautiful in a way that stops people and arrests people. And then, like all beauty, it points beyond itself. So thanks for saying that.
And tapping back into that idea that God does not need a penny of your resources to accomplish what he's going to accomplish. He's inviting you to step into that journey with him.
Yeah. It's so good. It is the season. Thank you for creating space. I know you're super busy. You're literally getting on a plane right now to go somewhere else. So we got to let you go, but this is the moment. So for everybody listening, as I said at the start of this conversation, a real success for V3 when if we're going to get the well done from God, which is the ultimate voice that matters, at the year end especially, it's that the life and beauty of the gospel would be expressed all over the world. And so wherever you're listening to this, I would just say, like, go back, listen to what Barrett said, and just pray about that. Like, God, how can I be more like him? And let the generosity of God just pour in and through my life. And he's way ahead of you. He's already put things on your heart and put ways that you can participate. NCF is great. So NCF is globally represented. So you can find an NCF. Just go to the website, National Christian Foundation. If you're not a part of it already, the Donor Advised Fund's amazing. You can reach probably out and find Barrett. I'm sure you're a pretty generous guy. So you'd let people reach and you'd at least direct them. But don't miss the opportunity to just widen and expand the love of God in and through your life this season. And of course, to participate with V3, we're a part of that Donor Advised NCF's charities. So if you're already a part of NCF, you can direct those to V3, and we're grateful for your work to do that. So Barrett, thank you just for embodying it, and for your friendship, and for your time, and just keep trusting God. It's awesome to hear your story, and from a kid breaking into safes to where you're pointing today is pretty cool. So thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah.